Some punishments in history were just too awful to be taught in school, and today we're here to peel back some of the monstrosities that used to exist. We've got lots of ways to die, ranging from death by molten metal to an eye for an eye and more, so prepare to be horrified. In ancient Israel, Mosaic law defined 36 crimes as punishable by death. Those guilty of interfamily coitus and adultery with the married daughter of a member of the priesthood were executed by burning, but not by being burnt from the outside. So how would this happen? So the guilty individual would go the way of a rope necklace by two witnesses integral to the case. It was a soft rope, as it was considered humane not to cause additional suffering with coarse material. So when the action caused the condemned to gasp for air, molten lead was then poured down their throat. Apparently this was actually the preferred means of death by molten metal. Marcus Licinius Crassus, an astoundingly wealthy Roman general, is rumored to have died this way, as was Roman Emperor Valerian the Elder. Spanish conquistadors used this technique, and so did a lot of groups in South America, as one corrupt gold-loving Spanish governor found out in 1599. At the end of the day, having lead or gold poured down your throat is a pretty sure way to die. Might rupture your organs, burn your lungs. You can't breathe. Ultimately though, it's actually the steam that pulls the plug. Li Si was a leading figure of early imperial China. A writer, politician, and philosopher, he eventually got on the wrong side of powerful political aide Zhao Gao, who had him taken out according to the ancient 5 pains. What happened? Well, first they chopped off the nose, then the foot, then the hand, then he was emasculated, then finally chopped in half at the waist. Gao also had Li Si's entire extended family killed, to the 3rd degree, in line with the ancient Chinese practice of collective prosecution. Back on the waist chop though for a moment. So this involved an executioner using a very large, sharp instrument to slice the wretched prisoner in 2 at the waist, which, by the way, that would miss the vital organs and cause a very slow, very painful death. This sort of punishment first appeared during the Zhou dynasty. Sometimes the chopping was not limited to one slice. Yeah, this was reserved for only the most serious criminals, or most hated people. The first Ming Dynasty Emperor, Zhu Yaozhang, sentenced a poet, Gao Qi, to be sliced into 8 parts for his politically satirical writing. During a different dynasty, an official was found guilty of embezzlement, and that's how he went. Now, despite being subjected to the chop, that official managed to miraculously remain alive long enough to use his redness to write the Chinese character meaning horrific or brutal 7 times before succumbing to his injuries. So because I mentioned earlier, this missed all your vital organs, a lot of victims would have their pain and suffering prolonged. And this chop wasn't formally abolished until the 18th century. In modern Chinese language, it has actually evolved to become a metaphor for the cancellation of an ongoing project, especially that of television programs. So it's like, oh yeah, Lost got cancelled. Whoop, wait, what a waste job. I think I got that right. In the time of the First Babylonian Empire in modern-day Iraq, the emphasis was on balance. The principle of talio, which was the law of retaliation, was central. So if you knocked somebody's teeth out, your teeth would be knocked out. Perjurers would lose their tongues, and if you committed a crime that involved genitals, you'd be castrated. Now, this didn't apply equally to everybody though. So if you were a free man harming or even killing a slave, normally you'd just get fined. This style of punishment extended to the death penalty as well though. So let's say you were caught looting a house fire. Well, that's the end of the line for you. Also, you'd be thrown into the building burning. And then you'd be thrown into the burning building as well. If you got caught burgling a house, yep, rope necklace time, right at the spot that you had burgled. Negligence could also be punishable by death. So let's say if you built a house and it collapsed and it killed somebody, end of the line for you. And the inequality of slaves during this time was also kind of an obvious thing. Line 218 of the Babylonian Code of Hammurabi specifies that if a surgeon kills a slave through malpractice, he only needs to restore, so replace the human being. Mithridates was a soldier who lived and fought during the First Persian Empire. Now, one time they were kind of under the influence at a royal banquet and they betrayed the confidence of the king. Now this king was now embarrassed and infuriated and ordered the most infamous punishment of the ancient world, scapism, or the boats. So according to Plutarch, writing hundreds of years later, this punishment began with the condemned being taken to a body of water and placed inside a boat. Okay, that makes sense. Another identical boat was then sealed on top of it to make sort of a shell, with the man's arms, legs, and head sticking out of the sides. He then would be force-fed honey and milk, covering his face and arms and legs with it too. And after a time in the direct sun, his face and limbs would become completely covered with flies. Suffering from a lot of bad, icky inner things in the boat, the vermin would feed on the excrement and then also start to enter the man's body and feed on that and devour him inside and out. Yeah, Mithridates apparently lasted 17 days in the boats before dying. Yeah, the merciless use of this death penalty was continued not just throughout antiquity in the Middle Ages, but also into the modern era. Like, if we want to talk about other examples, the BLOODY code system enacted in England in 1723 made over 200 offenses punishable by death, including damaging a fish pond, cutting down an ornamental shrub, and having a sooty face on a road at night. Yeah, don't cut down a shrub, folks. One of the reasons the army of ancient Rome was so successful was because it was highly disciplined, and the Romans believed that soldiers had to learn discipline the hard way. In fact, punishments used by Romans within their own military were some of the most crazy legal penalties in the ancient world. One such brutal mode of martial discipline was put forward by the Emperor Aurelian, who ruled in the 3rd century. Now, Aurelian stipulated that Roman soldiers who were guilty of having affairs with other men's wives were to be dismembered by tree branches. The condemned man would be tied upside down by their feet to 2 young tree branches, which had been forced downwards and bound together, creating incredible tension. When the trees were cut, the unfortunate fellow would be torn apart. The rebel leader Procopius went this way of death in AD 366. This method of end of life was also sometimes used in ancient Persia, which apparently was still used up until 1808. End of life by suffocation was a very common practice in ancient times. However, in the medieval period, to be specific, a very strange kind of technique was used, called mud, the Glorius Mud. Historians say that criminals were killed by throwing them in a pit full of stinky mud, and they would either die by drowning or by, well, lack of air. In medieval France, this was reserved for mostly unfaithful wives. For centuries in ancient China, and we touched on this a little bit earlier, there was a fate worse than death. This was known as miazu, a practice going back over 3,000 years. This was normally reserved for folks found guilty of treason. So if you ticked off the king, end of the life for you and also a lot of other people. So this was known as also the 9 kinship extermination, and this involved not just killing an individual traitor, but also their extended family. So we're talking like your parents, yes, immediate family, offspring, siblings, but then also uncles, aunts, cousins, sometimes even in-laws, depends on how many people are alive. Now, the method of end of life used on most folks was, you guessed it, that slow dicing that we talked about earlier. In 338 BC, an official named Shang Yang got on the wrong side of the King of Qin and was sentenced to be killed along with his whole family. They were dismembered and off with the head. Even as late as the 18th century, there were a lot of cases of familial end of life being used against rebels and traitors, and it wasn't officially repealed by the Chinese government until 1905. Time to talk about clubbing, and not the type that involves, drinking, dancing, partying, more like a form of the end of the life. This deadly Roman punishment, known as fusterium, was a penalty for cowardice. So troops who had deserted their posts or run away in battle would be bashed to death with blunt instruments by members of their unit. This harsh form of military discipline can be used for a range of other offenses by soldiers as well, including lying and stealing. This likely occurred after a successful battle, but sometimes it was done during battle. Apparently one time there was one soldier who ran away, everybody caught up to him. After a Roman failure, however, a whole cohort, so like 500 men, might have also been forced to take the blame. In these cases, several examples of which are recorded in the ancient sources, a far more severe punishment than fusterium was employed, decimatio. This involved the battle commander dividing a cohort of soldiers into 10 and then asking each group to draw lots. Whatever soldier in each group who drew the shortest straw, regardless of how he'd behaved in the battle or his status, would be clubbed to death by the other 9. A famous example of the use of this is in 72 BC during the war against the slave rebellion led by Spartacus. The Roman commander, Crassus, punished some of his troops who had broken ranks and scarpered in the heat of battle. Plutarch says Crassus killed 50 of his men, but another source puts the number at 4,000. A popular form of killing and punishing folks in the classical world was chucking offenders from a height, typically from a cliff, where the community would see them paint the hard ground below red. We all saw this in Midsummer. This was just a way of getting rid of folks, and you did something bad, this is your punishment. This legal lobbing from heights was used in ancient Greece, but the ancient Romans' use of it from the famous Tarpeian Rock is more well known today. So convicts of crimes like killing somebody and a lot of other things would be launched from the rock, which then sent them down the side of Capitoline Hill in Rome to death about 25 meters below. Now this rock was used a lot for public killings, from the time of Roman kings, over 2,500 years ago, to the 1st century AD. Surprisingly, considering the many different brutal methods of punishment used by the ancient Romans over the centuries, they considered this one of the worst ways to go, because there was so much shame attached. In an ancient city, some authorities used throwing from a height as a form of death, but not before the convict had endured 20 days of a peculiar type of public torment. So they'd be locked into a public pillory outside the town hall, and for 3 weeks they'd have to stand there, totally nude, covered in honey and milk. Why? You guessed it, dinner for the bees and flies. Then, off with the cliff, have fun, or not. And finally for today, another classical mode of killing folks, the breaking wheel. So this extremely simple device consisted of a wheel, and then you'd be tied to it, and then sometimes you get some spikes. You'd have all your limbs knocked with a club or something else, and with the turning of the wheel, all the bones in your body are going to slowly break, leading to an excruciatingly painful way to go. And that's it for me once again, folks. I've been Alexa, your resident emo girly. See y'all next time I buzz in over here at Bumblebee.